Part 10. The Destruction in Ancient America when Jesus Christ was Crucified. There were major natural disasters in ancient America at the time of Jesus Christ's crucifixion. But did you know that similar major natural disasters have happened 4 times in America since then? They're caused by the New Madrid fault line in the United States, and they make California earthquakes seem insignificant. These New Madrid earthquakes are estimated to happen about every 300 to 500 years, and they've only happened once since the United States has existed. That was over 200 years ago, in December of 1811 to May of 1812, and it rocked the land from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains, and from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. Cities, islands, and lakes vanished, new lakes were formed, the Mississippi River ran backwards, cracks opened up in the earth that ran for miles, and geysers of sand shot up out of the earth, burying everything around them. There was even thick vapor in the air that blocked the light of the sun, moon, and stars. And the whole country knew about these disasters. There's a lot of newspaper articles, books, letters, journal entries from that time period that you can research. There's also some easy sources that compile a lot of information about it. The ones that I have are a DVD documentary from the History Channel called Earthquake in the Heartland. And then I have a short, easy book called On Shaky Ground, The New Madrid Earthquakes of 1811 to 1812. And then I have a bigger, more detailed book called The Earthquake America Forgot. All of them are very good. Anyway, these major natural disasters happened in ancient America in the spring of 34 AD, which was actually the beginning of the new year for the Israelites. And you can read about this destruction in 3 Nephi chapters 8, 9, and 10 in the Book of Mormon. And since the people in the Book of Mormon lived in ancient America and had no contact with their homeland of Jerusalem, their prophets had prophesied that these natural disasters would one day happen as signs to let them know that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, had fulfilled his mission as the Messiah by suffering and dying so that all mankind could choose to repent of their sins, follow him, be saved from an eternal punishment, and be resurrected to a life of eternal happiness with him and our Heavenly Father. So, in this video, we're going to go over the similarities between the destruction in America at the time of Jesus Christ's death and the New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 to 1812. Now, right off the bat, for years, whenever I read about the Great Destruction in the Book of Mormon and the thick vapor and the smoke, I always thought, man, there must have been a lot of volcanoes going off at that time. But the Book of Mormon says nothing about volcanoes. It says nothing about lava. It says nothing about eruptions or anything like that. And when I learned about everything that was caused by the New Madrid quakes of 1811 and 1812, I was amazed that almost everything that happened in ancient America at the death of Jesus Christ happened in the New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 and 1812, including the thick vapor and darkness. So, let's start at 3 Nephi chapter 8, verse 5, when the destruction begins. First, it says, "There arose a great storm, such an one as never had been known in all the land." Then in verse 6 it says, "There was also a great and terrible tempest." Now the definition of a tempest is a violent windy storm. And the definition in the 1828 Webster's Dictionary, which was published during the time that the Book of Mormon was being translated into English, says that a tempest is an extensive current of wind, rushing with great velocity and violence, a storm of extreme violence. So basically, the modern and the older definition of tempest are the same. So I'm not sure what the difference is between the great storm in verse 5 and the tempest in verse 6. It's probably not a tornado because whirlwinds are specifically mentioned in verse 12. So maybe it's like what we'd call a microburst today. Now, I don't recall reading anything about great storms, tempests, or whirlwinds accompanying the quakes of 1811 to 1812, but throughout this entire planet, the most tornadoes and the worst tornadoes happen throughout the United States, east of the Rocky Mountains. So even though violent storms didn't happen during the quakes of 1811 and 1812, those quakes did affect the same vast area where some of the most violent storms on this planet happen. And to add to this, springtime is the worst time for tornadoes in the United States. And when was Jesus Christ crucified? In the spring. Now, God can cause violent storms and tornadoes to happen wherever and whenever He wants. But I just find it interesting that He's already set up nature to cause the most and the worst tornadoes in the world to happen throughout the same area that the new Madrid quakes affect. And all these things happen in the area where the Adena and Hopewell Mound-builder civilizations once lived, who match up very well with the Jaredite civilization and the Nephite-Lamanite civilization from the Book of Mormon. So next, verse 6 also says, "There was a terrible thunder, insomuch that it did shake the whole earth as if it was about to divide asunder." Now thunder happens during storms, and when lightning strikes nearby, you can feel the ground vibrate. But I don't think the great storm was the only thing causing this terrible thunder. Seconds before the quakes of 1811 and 1812 would happen, people would hear a loud thunder, which some said was indescribable, but others compared it to the sound of a violent tornado or a heavy cannon. And then the quakes would begin. And when they weren't experiencing one of the major quakes, the ground would still rumble. So to me, that sounds more like the thunder in verse 6 that did shake the whole earth as if it was about to divide asunder. Then verse 7 says, "There were exceedingly sharp lightnings, such as never had been known in all the land." And again, even though the reports of the 1811 to 1812 quakes don't talk about great storms accompanying them, the quakes did happen in the same land where some of the most violent storms and tornadoes in the world frequently do happen. Then verse 8 says that the city of Zarahemla did take fire. And as you read the rest of chapters 8, 9, and 10, it talks about a lot of other cities that burned as well. Now obviously the lightning could be one of the causes of these cities catching fire, but another possible cause for fires did happen in the quakes of 1811 and 1812. People had fires burning in things like fireplaces, lamps, candles, stoves, steam engines, all sorts of things, and hot coals from fires that were recently put out. So when the quakes hit, all these things were getting tossed around and starting fires in homes and buildings and burning them down. So that probably caused fires during the destruction in the Book of Mormon as well, because back then, people still used fire for light and heat, like they did in the 1800s. Another thing that may have caused some fires is seismoluminescence, which happened a lot during the quakes of 1811 and 1812. Seismoluminescence happens when quartz is squeezed together and creates an electric flash of light. If an earthquake is strong enough, it squeezes the quartz in the ground and creates flashes of light that shine from the ground in various colors. If the shock waves of an earthquake are moving fast enough, the flashes will happen so fast that it appears to be a continuous glow, like a light bulb. Many people saw this during the quakes of 1811 and 1812, but didn't know what it was back then. Now imagine one of these electric sparks igniting something that was flammable. So that could have been a cause for fires in the Book of Mormon as well. Something else that may have caused fires were petroliferous nodules, which are balls of tar that are blasted into the air along with other debris in the sand geysers. They're anywhere from the size of a pebble to the size of a golf ball, and they're flammable. So if one happened to catch fire somehow, it could have ignited other things on fire as well. These tar balls shot up with many of the sand geysers in the 1811 and 1812 quakes. Next, verse 9 says that the city of Moroni did sink into the depths of the sea. And as you read the rest of chapters 8, 9, and 10, it talks about a lot of other cities that were sunk and covered either by water or land. This same thing happened in the quakes of 1811 and 1812. Cities and villages along the banks of the Mississippi River sank into it. Hundreds of acres of land sank and water came rushing in to fill these areas, either from nearby rivers and lakes or from water gushing up from deep underground. At least 10 new lakes were formed, at least 2 islands in the Mississippi River sank, and at least 4 U.S. cities were submerged underwater. And who knows how many Native American villages were lost, because remember, in the early 1800s, this area west of the Appalachian Mountains was the western frontier of territory claimed by the United States, and was only sparsely populated with white settlers, and there were still far more Native Americans in the land. So we don't even know how many Native American settlements disappeared from these quakes. And in fact, the Kaw tribe says that long ago, what is now the lower Mississippi River actually used to be a massive inlet from the Gulf of Mexico, reaching up as far as St. Louis, Missouri. But after a great earthquake, it shrunk into what is now the lower Mississippi River. Now, to the ancient Israelites, whom the people of the Book of Mormon came from, a sea was anything from as small as the Sea of Galilee to as large as the Mediterranean Sea. So this massive inlet coming off of the Gulf of Mexico would have been a sea to the people of the Book of Mormon. Now, obviously, this inlet had shrunk into the lower Mississippi River earlier than the quakes of 1811 and 1812, and even earlier than the arrival of the Europeans, because it was a river when the Europeans arrived. But as mentioned earlier, these major New Madrid quakes are estimated to happen every 300 to 500 years, and they've happened at least 4 times between the time of Jesus Christ and today, with the most recent quakes being the 1811 and 1812 quakes. So was it only one of the earlier New Madrid quakes that shrunk the inlet into the Mississippi River? Or was it a combination of multiple New Madrid quakes over hundreds or thousands of years? I don't know. But it happened sometime while the ancestors of the Kaw tribe were on the land. Otherwise, they wouldn't have known about it and passed the information down through the generations. But I haven't heard anything about the depth of the ancient inlet either. Was it deep? Or was it shallow, like 20, 50, maybe 100 feet? I don't know. But I don't think it would have been nearly as deep as when you get out into the Gulf of Mexico. All I know is that with the combination of all the sediments rushing into the inlet from the upper Mississippi River, the Ohio River, the Missouri River, any other smaller rivers, and with previous New Madrid quakes causing land to rise and also shooting up massive sand geysers from deep underground, I can definitely understand how an inlet in that area could be shrunk into what is now the lower Mississippi River, which even today is still a massive wide river. And that brings us to the next topic, earthquakes causing land to rise. Verse 10 says that the earth was carried up upon the city of Maranahah, that in the place of the city there became a great mountain. And as earlier mentioned, when you read the rest of chapters 8, 9, and 10, it also talks about other cities that were sunk and covered with hills and valleys. Now, no mountains that I know of were formed during the quakes of 1811 and 1812, but new hills and valleys were created, and perhaps a mountain was formed in earlier New Madrid quakes. We don't know. And to consider a mountain great depends on what the people are used to seeing. For example, when looking at the hills of the Midwest, the Appalachian Mountains are great mountains. But when looking at the Rocky Mountains, the Appalachian Mountains are like little hills. And when I talk to people from the Rocky Mountains up in Canada, they say that the Rocky Mountains down here in the U.S. are little mountains compared to their mountains. So when verse 10 says a great mountain, we don't know what the size of the mountain is because we don't know what size of mountains the people in the Book of Mormon were used to seeing. Are we talking Appalachian size? Are we talking Southern Rockies size, Northern Rockies size, or even greater? We don't know. But land did rise in the quakes of 1811 and 1812. Places that used to be lakes and rivers were raised up and drained, leaving dead fish on the ground. Geysers of sand, called sand blows, would shoot up out of the ground sometimes as high as 100 feet, burying everything around it in a layer of sand that was in some places 20 feet high. Now that's not a mountain, but it is a hill. Now imagine if there was a city or a village there. It would have been buried. In other places, land would sink, and instead of water filling it up, sand would shoot up out of the ground and fill it in. So in addition to new lakes being formed, new hills and new valleys were formed. Even today, you can get on Google Earth and see some large areas of land that are still scarred with sand from the 1811 and 1812 quakes. Also, in some areas where the land cracked and split, it would leave a 10-foot difference in height. This also happened on the Mississippi River and created 2 waterfalls, which destroyed most of the boats that went over them. And this land rise in the Mississippi River completely dammed it for a few hours, sending a 30-foot wave backwards upstream for about 10 miles, and sending 15 to 20-foot waves onshore for about a quarter mile inland, destroying any village or city within its reach. Then the river finally got high enough to flow over the raised land, creating the two waterfalls, and all that water came rushing downstream again. Now that's pretty crazy. In verse 12, it talks about how the whole face of the land was changed, which is also mentioned several times throughout the rest of chapters 8, 9, and 10. This is exactly what happened during the quakes of 1811 and 1812. With all the lakes, rivers, towns, and islands that disappeared, with all the new lakes, swamps, and rivers that were formed, with all the land that had either sunken or risen, with all the forests that were splintered and leveled down, with all the massive sand mounds and sand craters, and with all the cracks that opened up, some of which were big enough to swallow houses and stretched on for miles. People said that while the quakes were happening, they could see the ground ripple just like water, and that it left their once familiar land unrecognizable. Verse 12 is also where whirlwinds are mentioned for the first time in the account, which I already talked about, but it also mentions the exceedingly great quaking of the whole earth, which was also touched on in verse 6 and is mentioned all throughout the rest of chapters 8, 9, and 10. Now, throughout the Book of Mormon, whenever it talks about the whole earth, sometimes it's talking about the whole land that they lived on, and sometimes it's talking about the entire planet Earth, and sometimes it's hard to tell. To me, it seems like it's talking about the whole planet here, because way over in Jerusalem, the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke in the Bible talk about how when Jesus Christ died, the sky got dark, and there was an earthquake that rent the veil of the temple and rent the rocks. And also in 1 Nephi chapter 19, verses 10 through 12, it was prophesied that when Jesus Christ died, darkness and earthquakes would be a sign given of his death unto those who should inhabit the isles of the sea. And even for those who may not have known who Jesus Christ was, it was prophesied that many kings of the isles of the sea shall be wrought upon by the Spirit of God to exclaim, "The God of nature suffers." So I wouldn't be surprised if these earthquakes were a global event. Was it equally disastrous all over the entire planet, or did some areas get it worse than others? I don't know. But from reading both the Bible and the Book of Mormon, it seems to me like the destruction in ancient America was worse. Now verses 13 and 14 also talk about how the earthquakes broke up highways, spoiled level roads, made many smooth places rough, and shook many cities till their buildings fell to the earth and were left desolate. All these things happened in the quakes of 1811 and 1812. And then, in verse 18, it says that the rocks were rent in twain. They were broken up upon the face of the whole earth, insomuch that they were found in broken fragments, and in seams and in cracks, upon all the face of the land. And as I mentioned earlier, there were many cracks that opened up during the quakes of 1811 and 1812, some of which swallowed whole houses and stretched on for miles. Some of these cracks filled up with water, some filled up with sand, but some just stayed empty and are still there to this day. And then in verses 19 through 23, the destruction ends after about 3 hours. And after it's all over, a thick vapor fills the air and blocks out the sun, moon, and stars, which causes darkness for 3 days. And the vapor is so thick that people can feel it, and it's so dense that nobody is able to start any fires for light. In fact, the vapor was so bad that chapter 10 mentions that some people died because of it. Well, the earthquakes of 1811 and 1812 also had dark vapor that filled the air so that the people couldn't see the sun, moon, or stars. It had a sulfurous smell and seemed to happen with each major earthquake. Some accounts reported that it would only last a few hours or part of the day, but there was one account from a Baptist minister named Wilson Thompson who lived in Kentucky, not far from Cincinnati, Ohio. He reported that, at least in the area where he lived, the darkness lasted for 3 days. His autobiography says, "For 3 days and nights, the sun, moon, and stars were concealed by a mist and a fog, which dropped like a heavy dew." There was another account written a few years later in 1815 from a woman named Eliza Bryan about the difficulty of lighting lamps in her area, which was near the town of New Madrid, Missouri. She said, "Ma tried to light the lamps, but the darkness was so dense they didn't help at all." There was also an article in the February 12, 1812 edition of the Philadelphia Gazette from a man who also lived near New Madrid during the quakes. He talked about the difficulty of breathing. He said, "At the time of this shock, the heavens were very clear and serene. Not a breath of air was stirring. But in 5 minutes it became very dark, and a vapor appeared which seemed to impregnate the atmosphere, had a disagreeable smell, and produced a difficulty of respiration." So there you go. That's my brief description of the similarities between the destruction in ancient America at the time of Jesus Christ's death and the New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 and 1812. If you want to be amazed, research the earthquakes for yourself. It's almost unreal. And again, to learn about the destruction in ancient America at the time of Jesus' death, you can read about it in 3 Nephi chapters 8, 9, and 10 in the Book of Mormon. And then comes the best part in chapter 11, when the resurrected Jesus Christ comes down from heaven to visit and heal the people whose lives were spared during the destruction in ancient America.